Everyone, this is Gene Jug History, and recently I broke down the three ancient racial groups, and I also did the three ancient unmixed groups as well. So I covered the bases with those, but now I want to break down populations within these racial groups. And pretty much I'm going to do it by continent, so I'm going to cover like Europe and break down to Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, and then in Africa, I'm going to cover North Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa, the Horn of Africa, and do that with all the continents and talk about how these geographic regions have been and are tied to racial groups, even though they are two different things. So obviously with this video, I'm going to talk about Northern Europeans. So I'm going to break them down as an anthropological, ethnic, and geographical group and their ties to race, talk about their history, how many of these people from this region in Europe connect together and are different, and the current connotations when it comes to race, culture, and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about it. First, from a geographic then ethnic and linguistic point of view and scope. So, from a geographic lens, Northern Europe generally includes Scandinavia, which includes Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, which is sometimes counted as something separate, the Baltic states, which includes Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The British Isles are sometimes considered part of it, so this is the United Kingdom, Ireland. Occasionally, northern Germany and the Netherlands are included culturally and or historically. So overall, this is primarily a cultural and linguistic definition rather than a rigid anthropological one. And then when it comes to the ethnic and linguistic lines, here is the breakdown. So Scandinavia is part of this region with the major ethnic and linguistic groups being Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes, with the main languages being of Germanic origin, Nordic culture, and Viking heritage. With Finland, the major ethnic/linguistic groups are the Finns and the Sami. The Finns speak Uralic languages, where the Sami are indigenous hunter-gatherers of Lapland. Iceland has Icelanders, which is primarily a Norse Gaelic descent, where they are of that descent, showing strong cultural homogeneity within that region. The Baltic states includes Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, which pretty much have Balto-Finnic, i.e. Estonian, and Balto-Slavic, i.e. Latvian/Lithuanian branches, retaining older European DNA components. And then we have the British Isles, which includes the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish, which have Celtic and Anglo-Saxon mixes, Norse Viking input in certain regions. Okay, so let's talk about this from an anthropological, historical sense regarding its origins. So, Northern Europe essentially had complex ancestries shaping or that were shaped by their migrations over the millennia. So, regarding its Mesolithic and Neolithic roots, they came from the hunter gatherers, which is an indigenous Mesolithic population from 10,000 to 7,000 years BCE and agriculturalists. So these are Neolithic farmers from 6000 BCE, so after the first group, from Anatolia brought farming, changing diet, social structure, and settlement patterns. Then we have to talk about the Indo-European migrations. So the corded war culture, so from 2900 to 2350 BCE, introduced Indo-European languages to much of Northern Europe, including Proto-Germanic and Balto-Slavic ancestors. Germanic tribes emerged in southern Scandinavia and northern Germany from around 500 BCE to 500 CE. Celts, so essentially people from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, retained more of the pre-Germanic population structures linguistically and genetically. And then now we're going to go on to the Viking Age and later movements. So the Scandinavians, which consist of the Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes, expanded across Europe from the 8th to 11th centuries. Migration, trade, and settlement led to some admixture in Britain Ireland, France, and Russia. So with Finland, the Ural-speaking population is distinct from the Germanic Nordic regions, though some Scandinavian influence definitely existed and still does. Iceland, so they settled mostly by Norsemen and some Gaelic, i.e. Celtic people from Ireland and Scotland. So let's look into the genetic and anthropological traits. So modern genetics and anthropological studies show that Northern Europeans generally have high frequencies of Y DNA haplogroups R1A and R1B, reflecting Indo-European migration. The Finns and Sami show more N1C haplogroups, linking them to Uralic-speaking Siberian populations. So when it comes to the phenotypes, they are historically lighter skinned, hair from blonde to light brown, and eye color blue, green, and gray due to selective pressures for vitamin D synthesis in high latitudes. When it comes to the height, Northern Europeans tend to be tall on average, with Scandinavian people on average being the tallest globally. So now we're going to start to see the process of them grouped together through a cultural/historical lens, where Northern Europe has been radicalized in history through ideas like Nordicism from the 19th to 20th century, essentially claiming that Nordic people are a distinct superior race. We're going to delve a lot more into that later on in the video, and it's pretty much a bunch of pseudoscience that's heavily discredited. Anthropology today focuses on the population structure, ancestry, and genetics rather than racial hierarchies, but it is important to connect them because the racial hierarchies come from somewhere and are still very ever present in our culture. Ethnic identity in Northern Europe often aligns with language, nationality, and culture more than superficial appearance. Okay, so now I want to move on today, i.e., why Northern Europeans is a thing and why there's almost like a monoculture or a mono identity in some way. And it's a mix of historical, cultural, linguistic, geographic, and sociopolitical factors, mainly or rather than a biological race. So let's get to it. Okay, so one of the reasons is geographic proximity. This obviously makes the most sense. Northern Europe is naturally grouped together because they share similar climates, daylight patterns, and environmental pressures. Geographic closeness enabled gene flow, trade, and migration historically and currently, creating a broadly similar group with similar ancestral patterns and admixtures. So this leads to the second one, which is shared ancestry and migration patterns. Most populations in Northern Europe share a core ancestry from Indo-European migrations, so from the Germanic and Balto-Slavic, mixed with earlier Mesolithic and Neolithic peoples. Scandinavia, the British Isles, and northern Germany experienced similar Viking, Germanic, and later medieval movements, producing overlapping ancestry in these populations. Even when populations like the Finns or Sami are distinct, historical interaction via trade, conquest, cultural exchange, etc., link them to the broader Northern European network. The third reason is linguistic and cultural similarities. So, Germanic languages, i.e., English, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, dominate much of Northern Europe, historically and currently. They also have shared religious and cultural history. Christianity, especially Protestantism in Scandinavia, Lutheranism in the Baltics, monarchic and feudal institutions, and similar social structures throughout their history. And the religion is pretty much the same today. They also have shared folklore, social norms, and historical experiences via Vikings, Hanseatic League, colonization patterns, which reinforces this grouping. The fourth is phenotypic stereotypes, i.e., similarity. So this is based on averages, not an individual basis by every single person in this area or who descend from this area. So populations in Northern Europe historically and generally have lighter skin, lighter hair, and a lighter eye color, a taller stature, and other physical traits due to adaptation to the northern latitudes. These visible traits become shorthand for grouping Northern Europeans, especially during the 18th to 20th centuries when European anthropologists and census takers tried classifying humans via race. So the important note, phenotypes are population averages. There is variation regarding the individuals, and these traits are only part of why the grouping exists, socially, not scientifically. And the final reason is modern socio-political and statistic grouping. So governments, academics, and popular discourse today often categorize people as Northern European or of Northern European descent for simplicity reasons. So for census and ethnicity categories and reasons, this often lumps Germans, Swedes, Norwegians, Dutch, and British together as Northern slash Western European. If you're interested in genealogy, people tracing their ancestry through DNA testing are grouped according to this as a genetic cluster that roughly matches historical Northern Europe. So this grouping ignores final distinctions like Uralic speaking Finns, Celtic peoples, or Sami populations, but work as a broad sociocultural category. Okay, so now we're going to go over a timeline that pretty much goes into the divergence and the regrouping of the Northern European populations, pretty much focusing on ancestry, culture, and then the later social categorization that's tying it to modern day. So the prehistoric period ranges from 10,000 to 3000 BCE, and this was when the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers started populating Northern Europe after the Ice Age happened. The populations are very small, isolated, and genetically diverse, so they didn't look like how they look like now. In 6000 BCE, Neolithic farmers arrived from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and introduced agriculture to the area. Early populations are regionally distinct, i.e., Scandinavia, the British Isles, the Baltics, and Finland, are developing their different gene pool. So then we move from the or to the Indo-European migrations, which happened from 3000 to 1000 BCE. So corded work culture and Proto-Indo-European spread across northern Europe. Proto-Germanic, Balto-Slavic, and Celtic roots start to emerge here, and the populations begin their linguistic and cultural divergence. So Scandinavia turns into Germanic tribes, British Isles turn into Celtic groups, Baltics turn into the Balts, i.e. Latvians and Lithuanians, and Finland turns into Proto-Uralic speakers. So we're going to the classic to early medieval period, so from 5000 BCE to 800 CE. Germanic tribes dominate Scandinavia and northern Germany at this point. Celts decline or are pushed west towards the British Isles. Uralic speaking Finns and Samis maintain their distinct identity in northern Scandinavia. Early Viking migration, so from 800 to 1050 CE, spread Scandinavian ancestry to the British Isles, France, and Russia. So the populations are starting to intermix, but their core regional distinctions and divergence are remaining. So now we're moving on to the High Middle Ages to the early modern era. So this is from 1000 to 1600. Regional culture solidifies, so Scandinavia, they have the regions being identified as Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes. The British Isles are identified as the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish. The Baltics are defined as Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians. So shared Christianization starts to happen here, as well as shared monarchies and trade, i.e., the Hanseatic League, which increases the cultural connections that they have towards one another. Phenotypic traits like lighter skin and hair and eyes become more common in high latitude populations. So the more north, the more common those phenotypic traits are. So the modern era, i.e., migration and global diaspora. So this is from 1600 to 1900. Northern Europeans migrate to the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand. Colonies categorize migrants broadly by language, religion, and appearance. Scandinavian, British, and Germanic groups often group together under Northern European or white categories. And this is where the start of race really became commonplace. Smaller groups like Finns or Sami may be misclassified or overlooked. And then now we're moving on from the 20th century to the present day, i.e., the social and statistical regrouping. So the census and genealogical categorization standardizes Northern European identity. Genetic studies confirm broad shared ancestry among Scandinavians, Germans, and the British. Northern European descendants worldwide retain a cultural linguistic identity, even if the ancestry is mixed. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the ancestry cultures of Northern Europe and then trace down and break down their diaspora, showing how they moved, mixed, and became socially grouped today and where their descendants are now. So, the first main cluster that I'm addressing here is the Scandinavian cluster. So, this includes Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. So, essentially the Nordic core. Their ancestry is mostly Germanic tribes plus the Viking expansions. They have minor Celtic and Gaelic input in Iceland and coastal Norway and Scotland. Their cultural traits are Germanic languages a la Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and Icelandic. Lutheranism, Nordic folklore, and maritime traditions are a huge part of their culture. The diaspora includes the United States, where large waves entered the country in the 19th to 20th centuries, especially Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Midwest. In Canada, many of them went to Manitoba, Alberta, and British Columbia. In Australia and New Zealand, their diasporas are smaller but notable. And in the UK and Ireland, some integration is present from the Viking era. So, Scandinavians often merge socially with other Northern Europeans due to shared language roots, religion, and phenotypes. The second cluster is the British cluster. So, this includes England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, with historical Norse and Norman influences. Their ancestry has a Celtic base, especially in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. There is an Anglo Saxon Germanic tribes, which is mainly in England. They do have Norse, Viking, and Norman French admixture, and their cultural traits involve English, Welsh, and Gaelic languages with a mix of Protestant and Catholic Christianity religion wise. And their legal and social systems exported globally via common law, or examples are common law and parliamentary tradition. Obviously, a large part of this has to do with colonization. The diasporas are huge, especially in North America, where the United States is one of them, especially in New England, Appalachia, and the South. The US was is an Anglophone country, and the same thing with Canada all around. In Australia and New Zealand, there are also British colonial settlements, so it's the same thing with them compared to the US and Canada. South Africa and the Caribbean, they are all, or their diasporas down there are a result of colonial era migrations, and there are some intermarriage with them and Scandinavian and German settlers in Northern Europe. So they're often considered the core Northern European group in global diaspora because of language and colonial influence. The third cluster I am addressing is the Baltic cluster. So this includes Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Their ancestry involves Balts, so Latvian and Lithuanian, and Finnic, which is Estonian populations. They are less influenced by German migrations than Scandinavia and the United Kingdom. Some Viking and Hanseatic influences along trade routes. When it comes to the cultural traits, they are heavily involved in the Baltic and Finnic languages. Catholicism is mainly present in Lithuania, while it's Lutheranianism in Estonia and Latvia. When it comes to the diaspora, they have small communities in the United States and Canada, mainly in cities like Chicago, New York City, and Toronto. They have diaspora in Sweden and the United Kingdom, which came from 19th and 20th century migration, and they are less visible globally than Scandinavian or British diasporas. So, Baltic people are sometimes grouped with Northern Europeans in broad ancestry studies, but genetically and linguistically, they are distinct from Germanic clusters. The fourth cluster is Finnish and Sami cluster. So this includes Finland, Northern Scandinavia, and Lapland, Sapmi, well, that's where most of the Sami people are. Ancestry-wise, they are a Uralic-speaking group, mainly Finns and Samis, and it's distinct from Germans and Slavic neighbors when it comes to that. Culturally, they speak the Finnish and Sami languages, as they are a Uralic family. The indigenous Sami culture involves reindeer herding, nomadic lifestyle, and even in non-Sami areas, these are very popular. Lutheranism is mostly present among Finns, though the Sami have their own traditional beliefs alongside Christianity. When it comes to the diaspora, they are mainly present in Sweden and Norway, especially the northern regions in those countries. They have small Finnish communities in Minnesota and Michigan in the United States, and they do have limited global, or they have a limited global diaspora compared to Scandinavian or British clusters. They're often grouped socially with Northern Europeans, but linguistically and genetically they are distinct. And the final cluster in this region is the German and Dutch cluster. So this includes Northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. So their ancestry or ancestry wise, they are Germanic tribes via Anglo-Saxon relatives. They have minor Celtic admixture in Northern Germany. Culturally, they speak Germanic languages, i.e., German, Dutch, and Flemish. They are a Protestant and Catholic mix religiously. When it comes to the diaspora, they are present in North America. They have communities in places like Pennsylvania, the Midwest, and Texas. So a lot of that came from the German settlers. There are large German diaspora communities in Brazil and Argentina. A lot of that has to do with the early immigration in the 20th century to South America and Latin America to whites in the countries and post World War II. And there are German settlers in South Africa from the 18th and 19th century. German and Dutch populations were often merged with Scandinavians and British and Northern European identity in colonies and census categories. So now I want to get into, and quote, Northern European as a social, cultural, and phenotypic category and the identity that it has created. So let's first start with the phenotype, i.e., the physical trait. So this is a population average, not a strict rule for each and every single individual in this group. So the typical range regarding the skin color is fair to light, and it evolved for better vitamin D synthesis in low sunlight regions. The typical range for hair is blonde, light brown, or reddish, though darker shades do exist due to historical admixture. The range in eye color is blue, green, and gray, most common, though brown is still present. When it comes to the height, they are generally taller on average than Southern Europeans, though the Scandinavians are, on average, among the tallest globally. When it comes to their build, on average, it is mesomorphic to ectomorphic, relatively lean with longer limbs, which is from the adaptation to the colder climates. On average, their facial features involves a narrow to medium nose, pronounced cheekbones in some populations, and variable jaw lines. So yet again, these are averages. So when it comes to culture, they do share broad patterns throughout Northern Europe, shaped by geography, history, and shared institutions. So language, it's primarily Germanic, i.e. English, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Dutch, Icelandic, with Uralic in Finland, Baltic languages in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. When it comes to the religion, it is historically Protestant, i.e., Lutheran slash Calvinist in Scandinavia, Northern Germany, and the United Kingdom, Catholic in Ireland, Lithuania, parts of Belgium, and minority indigenous regions, mainly Sami shamanism. The social norms in Northern Europe has a huge emphasis on egalitarianism in Scandinavia, especially rule of law, literacy, and civil participation. When it comes to the food and agriculture, it's heavy on dairy diets, grains like rye, oats, wheat, preserved fish slash meats, and it's also influenced by the cold climate. The architectures and arts involves wood slash stone buildings, Viking and Gothic heritage, minimalism in Scandinavia, and folk art traditions. Regarding the music and folklore, ballads are heavy, epic sagas, especially in Norse mythology. Polyphonic music and choral traditions is a heavy thing. When it comes to the work and societal values, there's a historically maritime slash trading focus, especially in Scandinavia, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, industriousness, punctuality, and planning orientation. So when it comes to the identity, it is shaped by ancestry, culture, and social perception. So components of this is one ancestral slash genealogical. So people with ancestry traced to the Nordic, British, Germanic, or Baltic regions may identify as Northern European. DNA testing reinforces the shared Northern European cluster, often combining Scandinavians, Germans, and the British. Two, cultural. Language, religion, customs, and traditions often define self perception as Northern European. For diaspora communities, culture practices maintain Northern European identity even after centuries abroad. Three, phenotypic social perceptions, which I've already gone into, but the average or the idealized phenotype of Northern Europeans has been associated with the quote unquote white identity in global diasporas, and it reinforces Northern European identity in the eyes of both insiders and outsiders. And four, the diasporic slash global identity. So, descendants in the US, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere often identify as Northern European in genealogy or census categories, and this identity merges historically distinct clusters, i.e., the Scandinavians, the British, the Germans, and Dutch, for social simplicity. So, essentially, Northern European identity is as much social and cultural as it is biological. Phenotype contributes, but shared history, language, and values are equally critical. Okay, so now I want to kind of do one more thing with this and how this ties into the hierarchy of whiteness and the social construction of the Northern European identity and the construction of their ways of white. So, obviously, as we all know, whiteness is a social hierarchy and category, not biological, and it's used and it's created to enforce power structures. Within European descended populations, Northern Europeans, i.e., Scandinavians, the British, Germans, and Dutch, were often placed at the top of the European racial hierarchy. And elements of this and factors that reinforce this involve phenotype, where they're seen as lighter skinned. They had more colorful hair and eyes compared to some of the other Europeans or non Europeans in general. Another element of this definitely had to do with culture and religion. So essentially, Christianity, mainly Protestantism, the law abiding image, literacy, and quote unquote civilized European traditions were valorized and passed down, especially through colonization in addition to another element being economic and political power, where Northern Europeans colonized most areas in the world, they controlled trade networks and created institutions that exported this hierarchy globally within other white people and non white people. So another level of this, in my opinion, comes from the diasporas that were created in other places, especially the Western world, via colonization. So the diaspora and whiteness. So in settler colonies like the United States, Canada, and Australia, etc., Northern European descendants were often the first to be recognized as fully white, and they're often the first settlers in these areas that were not indigenous. Other European immigrants, so Irish, Italian, Polish, and Southern Germans, had to quote unquote assimilate to Northern European norms via language, religion, and behavior to gain full social acceptance into whiteness. So a lot of them essentially had to leave their cultures and customs behind. The phenotypic similarity between Northern Europeans and their descendants reinforced this inclusion, and the deviations delayed or blocked it for other types of white people or other people in general. So, another element of this is culture as a marker for superior whiteness, and I do feel like this also ties into diaspora too. So, the culture of Northern Europeans, i.e., Protestant work, literacy, civic institutions, often valorized as the model for civilization, causing people from Northern Europe to be considered inherently trustworthy, industrious, and rational, while Southern and Eastern Europeans were stereotyped as emotional, less civilized, or prone to disorder. And I do think a lot of that is executed by the media even today, and especially back then too. This reinforced the hierarchies within whiteness, privileging Northern Europeans socially and economically. So its legacy today, Northern European traits and culture still anchor the ideal of quote unquote default whiteness in many Western contexts. So the census categories with white often implying Northern European ancestry the most. Media representation involves fair skin, light eyes, and straight hair, dominating Socioeconomic privilege, i.e., descendants of Northern Europeans, historically had easy access to property, education, and political power for longer periods of time, historically and currently, compared to other white ethnicities that had to quote unquote pass into Northern European norms to gain full social acceptance, a process sometimes called whitening of immigrants. And that concludes my video on Northern Europeans as a regional area, as a sociological, racial, socially constructed group, its history and how it's used currently, and how it's been tied to whiteness. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm going to try to do this for all the other regions in Europe, then do a similar video for other continents, and we'll just see how it goes. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.